I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Hello and welcome to Unstressed. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Well, today we're going to cover some territory. We're going to talk about food, we're going to talk about mental health, we're going to talk about life's journey. And who better to talk about all of those things with than my guest, Sarah Wilson. Sarah is a former journalist, a TV presenter, author and activist. She wrote the New York Times bestsellers, I Quit Sugar and First We Make the Beast Beautiful, which Mark Manson described as the best book on living with anxiety that I've ever read. She's also the author of another 11 cookbooks that sell in 52 countries. She's the founder of the largest wellness website in Australia, iQuitSugar.com, which closed in 2018, and she will tell you all about that. She now builds and enables charity projects that engage humans with each other. Boy, if there's ever a need for that, this is the time. And campaigns also on mental health and climate issues. In fact, Sarah ranks as one of the top 200 most influential authors in the world. And she's got a combined digital audience of 2.5 million. Sarah lives minimally, rides a handmade bike, and is known for travelling the world for 8 years with one bag. To pack so lightly, another thing I would aspire to. If you haven't read Sarah's latest book, you must. It is truly wonderful, moving and inspiring, and it's called This One Wild and Precious Life, a soul's journey through the complexities of climate change, coronavirus, racial inequalities, and our disconnection from what matters. In fact, back to life. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Sarah Wilson. Welcome to the show, Sarah.
Lovely to be here with you, Ron.
Thanks, Sarah. Listen, I love your books. I have to tell you that. I think I said to you when you wrote that book, I Quit Sugar, you guys, your whole team, did more in however many years than the dental profession did in 50 or 60 years. And I've said that publicly, and I've said that to you many times. I thought it was great. Listen, I don't want to dwell on that front too long because there's so many other things to talk about, but I'm just intrigued that if there was a person on earth that hadn't read I Quit Sugar and you met them and said, what do you do? What have you written? What would you say about I Quit Sugar? How was that to write and as an experience? Because it was much more than just a book.
Well, it was an experiment, It was an experiment I did on myself because I had compromised immunity and, had basically allowed the Western diet and Western living to take over my cellular system. Mm-hmm. And I went on a journey to try to sort of work out in a very naive journalistic way, because I was a journalist at the time, sort of a path through it all, because I had an autoimmune disease, Hashimoto's, for which there really is just a pill that's a very imprecise, a lot of imprecise science behind it. They sort of think it works, it sort of tops up thyroid function, but actually doesn't fix the original problem. And as you know, Ron, you've known me for a while, I'm not happy with a sort of a Band-Aid solution, so I went deeper and it was called I Quit Sugar. Basically, it's an invitation. It was I Quit Sugar. I gave it a go. I went down the rabbit hole of the science that was quite nascent at the time and emerged with a lot of information. It took me 2 years before I sort of emerged out there in the world with what I felt was a path through it. And I gave it a go. It worked for me. This is what it did. If you would like to do it, give it a go. It was never called You Must Quit Sugar. And it was done that for a very precise reason, and that is because humans, if we're told to not do something, we invariably want to do it. You see a wet paint, do not touch sign, you want to touch it. So I worked with a lot of psychology, actually, to because it's an addiction. And it's a physical addiction and it's an emotional addiction and it's a societal addiction, which makes it, a triage of, a triangulation of issues. So, that was the experiment and it continued. And then it turned from an ebook. It was very early days. This is like shortly after the last ice age. I taught myself how to, spend $100 finding out how to, doing a little course on how to write an ebook. And I thought, look, if it just covers that $100, I'll have done well. Yep. And anyway, it sold a few more copies than that. It became an Amazon bestseller, and then it became a print book. It became a New York Times bestseller. It sold in the end in 52 countries, and then it became an online wellness program with a bunch of staff. And then in 2018, I shut it down, primarily because I felt I'd done the work I was to do for the movement, which was to educate and get it onto the front page, of newspapers, to get it out there. And I felt that I'd done that. Anything further was about leveraging for money, and I'm not into that. That's not my principle. So I shut it down, sold off the assets, and gave every cent to charity. And I still make money from it because I still own the rights to it. And so I still sell ebooks, but all of that, and I sell a recommends tick that goes on certain supermarket products, like a Heart Foundation tick. And it just cut out then, didn't it? But I'll pick up.
But don't worry, this platform, Sarah, does wonderful things. So I'm just
awesome.
Learning about it. Anyway, go on, but you still hang on to some of the rights and still.
Yeah, and so I still give all of the money that I earn to charity at this stage. I mean, going forward. That's the story, I think.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story because I was actually, as you said, we've known each other for a while, and I was tracking how things were going. It was like a time-lapse photography of, okay, what's happening now? And 6 months later, what's happening now? And it just grew into this amazing platform, which I know, you were doing with Zoe. Zoe Eaton was there, and I've met Zoe. She's wonderful, and she's now working on Defeat Diabetes, carrying that on a little bit further. And then you wrote this amazing book, First We Make the Beast Beautiful. Tell us a bit about that, because that was a real personal story.
Yeah, so throughout all of this, and as a background to some of the autoimmune disease I mentioned earlier, I was diagnosed with bipolar when I was 21, and prior to that, a bunch of other anxious, quote-unquote, disorders. And again, I went on a similar journey. I wasn't satisfied with the medical understanding, and the medical understanding, was fine, except it didn't go far enough. It hit dead ends in its understanding. And so philosophy and spirituality filled in the gaps for me. And so I wanted to sort of work out where it all came together and whether there was a framework or a fresh lens through which people like myself and the world broadly could view this phenomenon, which of course was increasing and becoming an epidemic, as we like to use that word these days. I went on a similar journey. This one took me 7 years before I emerged with the book.
Wow.
And so I take a long time to do everything, Ron. Like, I'm a perfectionist, and I'm glad because, it means that I then don't land into trouble afterwards. And I'm discussing very important topics, really big topics. As my publisher said, Sarah, you just make a beeline for the hard stuff, Sugar. Nobody wants to quit sugar. I know. I'll suggest people quit sugar. And anxiety, again, it's something that people just want the drug, the diagnosis, and to go away and sort of hopefully live a normal life. But so this one, the premise of First We Make the Beast Beautiful it's from a Chinese proverb, and it's this idea that if we start to understand it as a superpower, as a gift, and to see it as beautiful, then we can find better ways to navigate anxiety. And throughout history, anxiety, in particular the sort of the so-called disordered ones, the ones such as bipolar, OCD, and so on, have been seen as sort of gifts in many ways. And so shaman and political leaders, like the number of world war leaders or wartime leaders who were bipolar is phenomenal. There's a huge number of them. Something like 70% of scientists have an anxious disorder, and poets notoriously, artists, philosophers, inventors have a disproportionate number of them have bipolar and OCD in particular. So, and I've also got OCD, which isn't me trying to plant myself in the same category as large poets and inventors, but the two disorders can sometimes travel together. So yeah, that's a discussion, that's a framing that we'd forgotten about, because in 1980, anxiety entered the DSM, the diagnostic tool that's used by the US and Australia and much of the Western world. And it became officially a disorder only in 1980. And what do you know? 1 year after the first anti-anxiety drug was invented.
Yes.
I don't know. I see a coincidence going on there.
No, I'm with you on that. I'm actually reading a book at the moment called Overprescribing Madness, which is Dr. Martin Whiteley's book, and he's coming on the podcast to talk about it, because it's a topic, you touched on the food and the advice that we're given food-wise, and that's not great. But when it comes to mental health, the DSM-5, which for those that aren't familiar with it, what is that? The Diagnostic and Statistics Manual 5? Yes,
number 5, that I think came out in 2016, I think
the first one was about 100 pages long and listed 30 or 40 or 50 conditions. The latest one was 900 pages long and listed 300 conditions or something like that. So we're all correct. We all have a mental illness, don't we?
Yeah, according to the DSM. And it's really interesting, actually. They've done studies where they've got, I think, 100 psychiatrists to look at the same patients who display bipolar behaviour. And only in 35% of cases did they have the same diagnosis. Sorry, only 35 of the 100 were able to agree on the same diagnosis using the DSM-5. Yeah. So even when you take the manual, the diagnostic tool, and psychiatrists work to the formulations and descriptions in there, they still can't diagnose accurately. So it's a very, very imprecise realm, as is the medication of these issues. Because, I grew up, in the 1990s. It was, I got diagnosed with my first anxious condition not long after Prozac Nation came out, and I was on one of the first, SSRI drugs that was introduced into Australia, so very early days. And, of course, it was all about a chemical imbalance in the brain, and you just had to inject a whole heap of serotonin to replace the serotonin that apparently I didn't have. We now know that that's a furphy. In fact, there's no science that points to this as a thing. And it's the drug companies that perpetuate that science, much like the way that the sugar industry and big food perpetuates certain stories around sugar. So it's a very, very similar etiology. And that's not to say drugs don't have their place. That's not to say that the impreciseness still can't actually be of some help. But it is imprecise. It's not set in concrete. And so there's space for us to explore it in a different way and to learn from how different cultures and eras were able to bring understanding and comfort. And I believe that once you start to have a knowledge of all the facets of things, then that actually brings about understanding, which brings about compassion, which brings about a softness, and then it brings about an ability to make choices about how you're going to use your anxiety and whether you're going to be a victim to it. And one of the big problems, which I'm sure your guest will speak to, because I'm sure this is the gist of the book, in terms of over-medicating, is that it actually creates this sort of victim mentality where you're at the behest of the drug companies. Oh, I've got a illness that I can't help myself with. I need an external fix. And we all know that really it's the journey inwards to find your own inner resilience and storyline through your stuff that actually produces the results in the end. And drugs and therapy can help, especially when you're young. I think for teenagers and young people, until they get the knowledge, until they can, what I call it soul nerding, and in my latest book I call it soul nerding, you go and research this stuff until you really get a understanding of how everything works. It is difficult. And so drugs and therapy and a diagnosis means that you can put it on a shelf marked, let's just take a break and I want to get on with my life as a young person, and I'll gradually learn more and more. But there is a responsibility, I think, to actually take that leap of faith inwards. And the medical industry actually discourages that.
And I think one of the confusing things for people is when there are experts or so-called experts, well, there are experts, I guess we'll call them experts, who will support the idea that, yes, there is a chemical imbalance and we need to intervene chemically, otherwise it could be serious. I think actually your focus there on young people too, because youth suicide is a huge and growing problem. And yet 15 years ago, the FDA said there are no antidepressants for kids under the age of 18 because of suicidal thoughts and outcomes. And yet still there are many young kids on antidepressants.
Yeah. Oh, look, it's a tricky one. I think what you're saying is some of these drugs can actually lead to suicide, and so they don't put young people on them. Yet it's probably young people that need something to get them through this difficult time. Now, ideal world, the something that they need is some friggin' resilience training. And this is where we have let down young people. And I was asked by the National Press Club a bit over a year ago to do a talk on anxiety in young people. And, you know, I was really nervous about it, and off I went down my rabbit hole, as I do. And I just had to call them and go, listen, the talk is about a lack of resilience epidemic. It's not the anxiety epidemic that's the issue here. And so that's what I ended up speaking to, is the fact that the lack of resilience. And, you know, there's absolute categorical evidence that this generation are less resilient than any previous generation, right at a time when they need to be more resilient, right at a time when ingenuity and ability to deal with uncertainty and ambiguity and risk is required to cope with what's ahead. And so I describe it as, you know, we've basically, they're like a wound with no ability to form a scab, because they haven't been allowed to fall off the bike and form scabs and bruises and sort of rough elbows, you know, and scabby knees that will protect them next time, and an ability to know, well, if you do this, then you'll fall in this direction. And so it's a real disservice. And that's the more worrying phenomenon. And of course, drugs and the medicalisation of any kind of distress and discomfort adds to this, because again, this is a generation, and also I say a generation, it's an era, because, you know, us as adults as well, we've been sucked into this because we also live in the times that these children have grown up in. And so we've got no ability, we've got far less ability. I witness in myself, I don't know about you, Ron, but far less ability to deal with risk and ambiguity and unknowingness, right? So we don't have to sit there wondering when the bus will come. We don't have to wonder how long our takeaway pizza is going to take, because we can see a little orb on the app that tells us how far away it is. We don't have to wonder if somebody's going to turn up, because we can text them and go, where are you? And yeah, so all the things that used to actually build up resilience, delaying gratification, sitting in unknownness, sitting in ambiguity and resting in it and staying longer with the problem. And, you know, Einstein famously said, I'm not smarter than anyone else. I just stay with a problem longer. Now, our culture goes, as soon as it gets uncomfortable, abort mission and place a complaint with management, you know, or distract yourself, or tell mum and dad, I can't even. Do school refusal or whatever it is. And so we've bought into it, and then we've passed it on to children, because parents, I witness it all the time, they've got no ability to handle the discomfort of seeing their child being bored. My parents, I mean, if I was bored, they just go, oh, get out of my way. Yeah. You know?
Yeah. I mean, I think to take that metaphor of the scab not forming, it's actually being washed away constantly by the stories that we are constantly bombarded with through the media, social media, and advertising. Those are what are constantly washing away the scab, to take this metaphor further. But anyway, you know,
life is meant to be perfect, and it's not meant to be uncomfortable.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And this focus on the self, you know, we are focused more on the I than the we. And I must say, I'm rather proud of the way in Australia we haven't done that. But certainly when you watch what goes on certainly in America, it's defending the I above everything else. But that's a whole other story. The journey that you spoke of is a wonderful segue into your latest book, which was quite a journey. I mean, many journeys, in fact. And I loved, one of the things I loved about the book, and I really did find it very moving, very inspiring, and I could hear your voice in it. Actually, you know, when I know you, so I literally felt like you were there talking, and I loved your little footnotes as well, which, you know, I think writing is very cathartic at the best of times, and to have those little footnotes is an added catharsis. Tell us about that book. Tell us about that book.
Yeah, it's called This One Wild and Precious Life, and
yes,
that was me kind of really coming out of First We Make the Beast Beautiful and touring the world. And it also became a New York Times bestseller, which, you know, I was very lucky that happened. And it took off in the US and came out in South Korea and Lithuania and whatever.
Fantastic.
It's been a gift, that book. The biggest gift was that it took me to an edge where I had to really confront my anxiety. And it's a bit like when you write a book about quitting sugar, you can't walk down the street eating a Magnum ice cream. Equally, I had to rise to the lessons I was preaching in my book, you know, and it was fabulous because it did get me there. So I built a certain amount of resilience and strength and wisdom from it, which, you know, the biggest fix for anxiety, go and write a book about it. Is what I would say. So I reached this point where I realized I was talking and out in the world, and I was living on the road, as you know. I'd come back into Sydney every now and then, go to the dentist, do things like that, and then take off again. Yeah, to go off again with my backpack off to Greece or wherever. I was literally living as a nomad for 8 years with one bag of possessions. And I realized that the anxiety epidemic was now global. It was happening at a broad collective level. And so it should, because anxiety is there to trigger us that something's not right and to shift course. And that's essentially what I feel is what the COVID crisis, if you want to call it that, the climate crisis, the fragmentation happening in all directions. It's the whisper in the ear, the tap on the shoulder to humanity going, this is not right. Bring on flight or fight. Let's fight for this, you know, let's defend, let's survive. So I felt that needed to be written about. Now, I've been in the climate movement for 10 plus years, as you know. You know, I live it, I breathe it. I don't own a car. I always arrive in your dental surgery with my bike.
I don't know. I think we have a special bike rack there for you.
I don't think I just sits out the front. Your staff are very tolerant. So I realised that the message of the climate crisis and this emergency wasn't getting through because we'd got into overwhelm. So there's flight or fight. And then when those don't work, which is very hard when you've got what's called a hyper-object problem, a problem that's so large we're in it, we can't actually extract ourselves to see what the hell's going on and see how to fix it. We then go into freeze, and we're in a collective state of freeze at the moment, and which is exactly where we can't be. It's a bit like children who can't form a scab at a time when they really need to protect themselves. We are in that vulnerable state if we are going into an overwhelmed, frozen state. So I figured we needed a book for that. And so it was, you know, a hopeful path forward in a fragmented world is the subtitle. And I went down, that one took me 3 years. And I wrote it through the bushfires. I wrote it through the onset of the COVID pandemic. Then Black Lives Matter happened, and Me Too happened. And eventually my friend said, can you just get this book to the printer? Because aliens are going to land next if you don't get it there.
A book is never finished. It's abandoned. Like that right. Anyway.
Or as Seth Godin says, you just ship it, get it out, just get it out. Yeah. It traverses all of that. And again, I write it with a bag on my back and I hike around the world in the footsteps of the great philosophers, poets, thinkers who have confronted these issues previously, albeit at different levels, and essentially confronted our existential demise in various ways. And so I wanted to find the right wisdoms that could guide us forward, because the current mindset, the current paradigm of I, of us versus them, of blaming is not working, and it's destroying the planet. And neoliberalism has a big part to do with it, and I write about that in the book. It's the path forward, just to give away the ending to everyone, is essentially to be found via nature. And it sounds very woo-woo, but I actually I go into the science. So I head off to Japan to meet a monk who is meant to be an expert in forest bathing. And of course, in Japan, they've consulted 40,000 studies that show how hiking in nature is part of their healthcare system, and so, how that can actually be one of the most powerful salves. And yeah, so that's the book. It's a journey to find the path forward, and it turns out that as I'm hiking around the world, I realize this is the path forward, because we as humans are extraordinary. We have incredible strength to save what we love. You know, the example of the 45-kilo mother who can lift a car off her toddler when it rolls back on her child. We can find Herculean kamikaze-like strength when we love something hard enough. And so my book is a journey to remind us, to take us to that place where we're reminded of what we love. And what we love is nature. We love the congruence. We feel complete. We feel like we belong. We feel love, and we feel part of something when we are in congruence with nature and with our nature. Our nature as a collective. And so that's what the book tries to do.
Yeah, well, it was, as I said, I just loved it. And particularly for myself, who had spent the last 10 years hiking across Spain, through France and Italy. I've done the Camino, the French Camino, and the Via Francigena, as I pronounced it correctly. And just that action of slowing down and walking from one village to another instead of driving. And what was that just went by? And we fly over things and we drive through things, and just approaching things at a human scale is so cathartic. So for me, it is beautiful. It's a beautiful book. I love it. Now the next thing, Sarah, we could talk forever, but I was interested to hear that you've now got your own podcast called Wild. And isn't that the best thing? I mean, like this, I get to talk to people who know so much more than I do, and they answer the questions every week, and I get to learn. And you've had some amazing guests. I mean, Tim Brown, I've had Tim on myself, and Tim is just an absolute legend teaching meditation. Rutger Bregman, another hero of mine. Tell me about your podcast and a highlight. That's got to have been.
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, Rutger Bregman, he wrote the book Humankind, which is about the fact that we are actually far kinder than the evolutionary theory likes to postulate.
Yes, I love that.
Yeah, and even if there's certainly big slabs of truth to it, like I'm convinced by his arguments, but even if you sort of go, well, there's somewhere in between, I mean, it's a fascinating romp.
Absolutely.
And
homo, what does he call it? Homo puppy or homo friendly?
Yeah, the puppy. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a wonderful book, and he's a great speaker. I mean, he's 12 or something. I think he's 32, but he's an incredible thinker. And what I love about podcasts is 45 minutes to an hour of nuanced discussion, and to just sort of bring it back into the walking side of things. Walking goes at the same pace as discerning thought, right? As does handwriting, and as does human-to-human discussion. It goes at the same pace as discerning thought. And I would sum up a lot of the problems in the world as a lack of discerning thought,
Absolutely.
So a podcast, the podcast is Wild, where I take one wild idea that I've heard a wild liver, postulate, and I go and do a deep dive with them for 45 minutes or so. So Rutger Bregman, Seth Godin, he had a big impact on me about 12 years ago. So some people that I've met in my journey, traveling the world and running into people, and then it's other people that I've read their book and I'm like, I want to discuss that idea further. And so I've just come from recording a guest for my next episode, and I don't mind sharing it with you.
Sure.
Jill Bolte-Taylor, Dr. Jill Bolte-Taylor. I don't know if you recall her. She, it was the first TED Talk I ever listened to, and it's the second most watched TED Talk in history, about how she had a stroke. She's a neuroscientist who had a stroke, and she was able to witness her left brain shut down and her right brain, the intuitive side that experienced life as a oneness, take over. And oh my God, that was the wildest conversation. So I've just come from that and I get to talk to you. But yeah, I mean, that's where my life is at. But the meta thing that I'm trying to do here is steer conversations towards a way of living and thinking that can hopefully, again, bring us back to our nature so that we can goddamn well save it. Because everything I do now, I have given everything away. I have sacrificed everything. And that's not me big noting myself. What I'm trying to say is, like, nothing matters to me more than attending to the climate crisis, being of service in whatever way I can, whatever humble way I can, to humanity as we face the reality of a planet that is on the brink, or a species that's on the brink. The planet will be fine. We are the sixth extinction.
Yes, I mean, that is a source of great frustration. I wonder if part of the problem is that you mentioned the freeze response as a response to stress, and that's an interesting one because we always hear about fight or flight or rest and digest, but there is that other one, the freeze response. And I wonder whether what we need to start doing is articulating for people a rosier future of what is possible so we can strive towards it rather than ignore what is facing us.
That has been the approach that the environmental movement has taken. It's the approach that scientists have felt they've had to take until recently, and it hasn't worked. So this idea of softly, you can recycle your way out of this. All of that kind of thing. I know you don't mean that.
No, I'm talking about, imagine no fossil fuel cars. It's quieter in the whole of this country. The air is cleaner, so 6.5 million people aren't dying from air pollution, say. Or all of those spaces that have opened up because we don't need cars anymore are now community gardens, and we meet our neighbours and we do all that. So to take it beyond the recycling, I just did an interview with Tim Silverwood, and he's not convinced recycling is good. There's no doubt about that. You've got to turn it into a commercial thing. But I just wonder about really painting a picture that we can go, wow, I want to live in that world.
Yes, I think that's got to be a very big part of the messaging. But I will also say very honestly, we've also got to grow up. We've got to grow up and face the difficult emotions. And this comes back full circle to this resilience thing. We don't like discomfort. Well, I hate to say it, the truth right now is really radically and critically uncomfortable. And so I think that this kind of rosy future thing can sometimes be a distraction from people facing their fear. Now, the best way for us to move forward into radically, and it's going to take a kamikaze effort, we have got negative time left. Okay, so the IPCC report came out recently saying code red for humanity. Now, bear in mind that the IPCC report is one of the most conservative, watered down versions of a scientific understanding of things, because it's got to get close to 200 countries to sign off on it. Australia signed off on it. America signed off on it, right? For that to happen, it's got to be a fairly watered down version. So bear that in mind, that we're not even getting the full travesty scenario presented to us yet, unless you actually speak to the scientists directly. So I am more focused on getting people to face the discomfort, to face these feelings of fear, anger, frustration, because we're not going to get anywhere, because they're going to come up no matter where we go with rosy future predictions and image painting. And we're not going to get there if we don't fight for the government that will bring about electric vehicle incentives and infrastructure, and we'll put an end to coal immediately. Like, even the coal industry's peak international body has said to reach net zero by 2050, we have to go zero coal now, immediately. Even they're saying it, and our government won't say it. The hard truth is the more important thing to focus on, and the potential rosy future is a nice thing to talk about as dessert, if we can put it in those terms. We've got to eat our meat and veg first.
Okay, I take that point. And listen, what are the pandemic? How are you viewing it? What's your thoughts on that? How are you seeing it?
Well, I see it as that whispering in the ear, the tap on the shoulder, and it's now the shove, right? It's basically saying, this is not viable. The centre will no longer hold. Humanity, wake up. And so I see it as that. And it's not so much that we got this virus because it'll teach us, this direct lesson. It's more about, well, it's kind of perfect in the sense it sent us to our bedroom to have a good hard look at ourselves. Now, do we wish to, I think Naomi Klein said this. No, it wasn't. It wasn't Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein quoted Milton Friedman, the original neoliberal. He said, only a great crisis brings about change, but it depends on the ideas that align around at the time. And so as we emerge from the pandemic, this is what I'm interested in. What's the world that we're going to create? And so right now, as we're locked down, as we are in much of Australia, I'm sure we still will be when people listen to this podcast, or at least we may be back in another lockdown, with another version of the pandemic. I don't know. We have the opportunity to have a good hard look at ourselves. That's what I feel this is about. This is the pandemic's been a great revealer. It's been that as well. So it's ripped that Band-Aid off and exposed the wound. And so what are we going to do about it? Are we just going to put another Band-Aid back on and try to go to business as usual? There is no new normal. There's no normal. We can't go back to the way it was. So we're going to have to really start to create. And it's an opportunity. And I see it as an exciting opportunity. But we're going to have to let go of a lot of old ideas because they don't work anymore. Look at retail. Retail cannot work in the new global order. And we're not going to go back to where we were. It's not possible, in part because the climate crisis. In Australia by 2050, we will not have a winter. And summers will be intolerable. And animals will have to be kept in zoos. I was speaking to Professor Leslie Hughes, who's one of the IPCC scientists. She's one of the lead authors. And I said, and she's an expert in biology. I said, what about these animals, the picture book animals we love, koalas? Are they going to be extinct by 2050? Are children today going to be able to take their children out to nature and see them? Look, they won't be extinct. They'll be in zoos. They'll be in, we'll have to have these climate-controlled, air-conditioned zoos with gum trees. No, you'll still be able to see them. And she saw that as a good thing because such is her mindset. So, that's how she's trying to see a rosy picture for things. That is what we're facing. We are not going to be able to go back to normal. So, yeah, that's my take on it. I also see it as an opportunity. We talked about the I versus the we. And so if we're going to get into vaccination, masks, hoo-ha, leaving aside what we feel about the imprecision of the medicine perhaps and that kind of thing. And there's valid question marks over all of it. And it's not ideal, but then we are not in an ideal scenario. We're in an emergency, right?
Yeah, I agree.
In emergencies, we have to suck up the kind of shittiness and the compromise, and we've got to attend to the collective. So we don't have fangs, we don't have poison, we don't have hooves, we don't have anything to defend ourselves. All we have is the tribe. That is how we've defended ourselves and risen to the top of the food chain. So all we have really as a species is our ability to coalesce as a collective. And what we're being asked to do here is to wear a mask, to have a vaccine, to protect the collective. And what's happened is the neoliberal system has seen us swing way too far to the individual, where it's all about sovereignty and my gut health and my green smoothies and all of this. And we've forgotten that it's the collective that we need to be also looking after. And so I don't like a lot of aspects of things. I've got lots of criticisms of the way it's been handled. However, I suck it up.
I agree.
Because there is a bigger picture here. And the bigger picture, even bigger picture than all of that, is there's a climate crisis. And whenever we're talking about anti-vaxxers, vaxxers, all of this stuff, the bigger crisis is getting worse. It's a distraction, people. Yeah. And we need to get back to the real thing. We need to get back to the love of this planet. We need to get back to being human.
Well, Sarah, what a note for us to finish on. And I too see it as a great opportunity, this pandemic, an opportunity of global reflection. So thanks for your thoughts and sharing that with us. We're going to have links to your book, to your podcasts. They're all so wonderful. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, Ron, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Sarah is just so wonderful. I mean, she's a prolific author and she's a great thinker, and I think what she's been doing has been fantastic. And I've known Sarah for over 10 years now, I think, and watching that journey from her time with I Quit Sugar, and as I said, as a dentist, I could only admire of what she's done for sugar, because the dental profession have been talking about it for 50 or 60 years, but she and the I Quit Sugar team achieved more in that time and raised awareness and made a huge difference, and started a conversation which sadly wasn't happening at the government, at public health message levels. So that was amazing. And then her book, First We Make the Beast Beautiful, and to take such a personal account of her own mental health issues and discuss them in such an open and honest way, is really empowering, and to see the positives in rather than pathologizing things. It's so interesting when it comes to mental health, and we're going to be exploring this in the coming weeks as I have the opportunity actually of talking to the author of Overprescribing Madness, Dr. Martin Whiteley. But this whole mental health issue is a huge one. The DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual that we touched on, is just a book that really, if you read it, we all would have mental health issues, and no doubt there would be a medication attached to that. For example, you know how you feel better in summer than you do in winter? And one could certainly say that has something to do with your exposure to the sun and vitamin D. No, that's called seasonal affective disorder, and you might need an antidepressant for something like that. Or you remember when someone died, you might grieve. Well, there's a whole mental disorder there, because grieving is apparently part of a mental condition as well. So anyway, that book, and then her last book, This Wild One and Precious Life, is such a great journey. I mean, as I mentioned, I've been doing a lot of walking over the last 10 years, and when you set off on a journey and the pace of that movement is slow, and on a human scale, you do fly to get there, but once you're there, you cover 10, 15, 20 kilometres or more a day, and you walk from one place to another. It just slows you down. It connects you with nature. It puts everything on a more human scale. And we really need to be reminded of that. And like Sarah, I see this pandemic as an incredible opportunity, an opportunity for us to reflect on a global scale. And hopefully we will emerge from this really reconsidering what is important. And I think the lesson that we're learning, is how important those real things around us are, the nature, our local environment, our local community, but that all makes up a whole global community. So while I kind of tried to pose a more positive spin, and maybe we could articulate a more positive message, and I wasn't just talking about recycling, I was talking about painting an image of a city that is green, clean, renewable, recyclable. There is a circular economy. All energy is free, clean and green. Every product that we buy, and let's face it, I don't think capitalism is going away anytime soon, but every product we buy has to be recycled. And that's the responsibility of the manager, of the manufacturer, and all of us as consumers. So there is an opportunity here, because we'll have cars that are self-driven cars. We won't need cars, and that'll free up a whole lot of space for us to start community gardens and connect more as a local community. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about, but I totally get what Sarah is saying there, and say, let's not gloss over it. We are facing a major existential threat, and we need to grow up. We need to take it seriously. We need to stop being distracted by the I and the me, and think more about the we and the world, because as we've said many times on this podcast, we are all connected, so we are all affected. Look, we're going to have links to Sarah's site and Sarah's books, and have a listen to her podcast. She's got some great guests. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. For content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.